The dinner table should have been a place of warmth, but instead, it turned into a battlefield. My daughter-in-law, Clara, slammed her fork down, her voice cutting through the silence like broken glass. "I want the keys to this house. Tonight?" Her demand left the air thick, heavy, almost choking. My son shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering over his glass, but he didn't say a word. All I could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the pounding of my heart. On the table, between the plates of untouched stew, lay a folded envelope. It had arrived in the mail that afternoon, addressed to me in my late husband's handwriting, a handwriting that should have been impossible, because he had been gone for 6 years. The ink was fresh, the words trembling across the page. "Do not give her the keys. Trust what you find hidden." What did it mean? Why now, of all nights, and how could a letter from the dead appear exactly when Clara demanded entry? Stories like mine are never simple. They begin quietly at a dinner table, then spiral into secrets that change families forever. I'm sharing this because I know I'm not the only one caught between loyalty, fear, and unanswered questions. Where are you listening from right now? Tell me in the comments. I want to know whose kitchen, living room, or quiet corner my story is reaching. I'll choose one of your stories for next week, because hidden truths live everywhere. But to truly understand what happened that night, I must take you back to where it all began, to the house itself, and to the people who filled it with both laughter and resentment. My name is Margaret, though most call me Maggie. I am 62 years old, a retired school librarian who spent decades teaching children how to uncover truths between pages. My life has been quiet, structured, and deeply tied to this house, a modest 2-story home of pale brick and ivy creeping along the back wall. The mortgage was paid off years ago, and every corner holds memories of my late husband, Richard. His leather chair still sits by the window, and sometimes when the wind rattles through the frames, I swear I can hear him clear his throat as if about to speak. Richard was a man of detail. He kept meticulous records, every receipt filed away in labeled folders, every letter tucked neatly into a cedar box in the study. When he passed suddenly of a heart attack 6 years ago, he left me not just with grief, but also with the fortress of this house, a place worth nearly $500,000, my only true inheritance. I vowed never to leave, because leaving felt like erasing him. Our son, Daniel, was 27 when Richard died. He had always been thoughtful, a quiet child who preferred chess to football, and who could sit for hours sketching mechanical designs in his notebooks. After Richard's passing, Daniel became the silent anchor in my life. He would mow the lawn without being asked, sit with me for tea, and sometimes read aloud from Richard's old engineering manuals, as though resurrecting his father's voice. When Daniel brought Clara into our lives 3 years ago, I wanted to welcome her with open arms. She was striking, tall, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair that framed her face like a curtain. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed her space. At first, I mistook it for strength. Daniel, always gentle, seemed dazzled by her energy. Within months, they were married in a small ceremony at the courthouse. I stood beside them in the photo, clutching a bouquet of lilies, hoping my stiff smile concealed the unease I already felt. Clara moved into the house immediately, and things began to shift. The sound of her heels clicking down the hallway echoed late into the night. She rearranged furniture without asking. Richard's chair was moved from the window to the corner. then to the basement, where dust gathered around it like punishment. She insisted on repainting the kitchen walls a sterile white, erasing the warm yellow Richard and I had chosen together. "Fresh starts need fresh colors," she had said, her hands already dipped in paint. Daniel simply nodded, too eager to keep peace. At first, I told myself these were minor things. Change was natural, but small irritations grew. Clara began asking about the house deed, about whose name it was under. She framed the questions as practical. "Just in case something happens, Maggie, don't you think it's smart to plan?" But I could feel the weight beneath them. This house, valued at $500,000 and growing each year, was more than just walls to her. It was power, security, perhaps even a prize. The tension deepened when she suggested they take over the upstairs floor, leaving me downstairs. Privacy, she argued, for all of us. But it felt like being slowly pushed out of my own life, one step at a time. Still, Daniel loved her, and I wanted to respect that. I told myself that love was about compromise, but compromise soon turned into silence, into swallowing words I wished I could say. My world beyond the house had shrunk too. Retirement left me with free time, but loneliness weighed heavy. My friends had their own families, their own grandchildren. I had Daniel, and I feared that if I clashed with Clara, I might lose even him. The days blurred with the scent of coffee brewing in the mornings, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and the faint creak of floorboards whenever Clara paced upstairs. Each sound reminded me that I was no longer the sole mistress of this home. There was one neighbor who noticed. Mrs. Grant, who lived 2 houses down. She often dropped by with baskets of fresh bread. "You look tired, Maggie," she would whisper at the door, her eyes flicking toward the window where Clara sometimes stood watching. I brushed it off, insisting I was fine, but part of me wondered how much she sensed. By the time that dinner came, when Clara demanded the house keys outright, years of quiet erosion had already carved away at my peace. What struck me most wasn't just her audacity, but the timing. That very afternoon the letter had arrived, an envelope with Richard's handwriting, the loops and slants of each letter as familiar as my own reflection. I hadn't told Daniel or Clara about it. I had slipped it into my apron pocket, intending to open it later in solitude. But when Clara's words shattered the air, "I want the keys to this house," the envelope's weight felt like lead against my hip. It wasn't only suspicion anymore. It was certainty that something larger was at play. My husband's voice, reaching across 6 silent years, was warning me. And suddenly, the stakes were clear. This wasn't just about sharing space or repainting walls. It was about ownership, about control of the house that represented my life's work and my husband's legacy. If I yielded, I could lose everything: the home, the memories, even the last thread connecting me to Richard. $500,000 in property, a roof over my head, the sanctuary of decades, it could all vanish with the turn of a key. So when Clara leaned forward that night, her eyes glinting like steel in the candlelight, I knew we had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. But that night at the dinner table was only the beginning of the storm. Clara's demand for the keys might have sounded like an impulsive outburst to anyone else, but to me it was a signal, an alarm ringing inside my chest. The stew on our plates had gone cold, its scent of thyme and onion now heavy in the air, almost bitter. Daniel cleared his throat, his eyes darting between his wife and me, as though he were a child again, caught between parents in the middle of an argument. He finally spoke, his voice soft, barely audible. "Clara, Maybe this isn't the right time. She shot him a look so sharp it could have sliced through glass. If not now, when? We live here, Daniel. We deserve to have access to every part of this house. Don't you think it's strange that certain doors stay locked? My hand trembled under the table. Richard had always been careful about which rooms were locked, even when he was alive. The study, especially, had been his sanctuary. After his death, I had kept it the same. Door locked, key tucked away in a small box only I knew about. It wasn't just a room. It was memory, preserved, untouched. Clara's eyes flicked toward me. Maggie, I'm not asking for much. Just trust. Don't you think it's fair? Her words dripped with practiced calm, but her foot tapped beneath the table, a nervous rhythm betraying her hunger for control. Before I could answer, I felt the crinkle of paper against my hip. The envelope? Richard's handwriting. That impossible letter had already warned me. Do not give her the keys. Trust what you find hidden. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice steady. The study is private. Some spaces are meant to remain closed. Clara leaned back, folding her arms. Her perfume, a sharp floral too sweet for the small room, seemed to smother the air. Private, she scoffed. Or secret. The word hung there like smoke, refusing to dissipate. That night, after they retreated upstairs, I slipped into my bedroom and locked the door behind me. With the bedside lamp casting a pale glow, I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, folded twice. My hands shook as I read Richard's words again, the ink strangely fresh, as though written that very morning. Do not give her the keys. Trust what you find hidden. The truth is in the study. I pressed the page to my chest, my heart pounding in uneven beats. How could this be? Richard was gone. His grave was real, his funeral witnessed by dozens. And yet here was his warning, timed precisely, with Clara's demand. I searched the envelope for postmarks, dates, anything that might explain. But there was nothing. No stamp. No seal. Just my name on the front in Richard's familiar looping script. Sleep evaded me. All night I lay listening to the creaks above my head, the soft murmur of Daniel's voice and Clara's sharper replies. At one point, footsteps descended the stairs. I held my breath as they paused outside my door. Then silence. A retreating step. By dawn, I knew one thing. I had to search the study again. I had left it untouched for 6 years, dust settling over Richard's files, his fountain pens lined neatly in their case. But now, his message had shifted everything. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint smell of damp earth from last night's rain. I moved quietly, careful not to wake them, and unlocked the study door. The hinges groaned in protest, as though resenting being disturbed. Inside, the room was dim, curtains drawn tight. My fingers traced the edge of Richard's desk, polished wood smooth under my touch. Every object was as he had left it. Books lined up alphabetically, framed diplomas on the wall, the faint scent of leather still clinging to his old chair. But then, as I crouched to pull open the bottom drawer, I found it jammed. When I forced it open, something shifted, something hidden beneath the false bottom Richard had once mentioned, but never shown me. There, wrapped in a brittle sheet of newspaper dated decades ago, lay the first piece of undeniable evidence, a smaller box, metal, locked with a tiny keyhole. And in that moment, Richard's words echoed in my head with bone-deep certainty. Trust what you find hidden. What I didn't know was that the box in my hands would unravel everything I thought I understood about my family. Its cold metal surface felt heavy, almost too heavy for its size, as if the weight inside was more than just objects. It was truth, sealed away for years. The keyhole mocked me, small and precise, daring me to find a way inside. I hid the box beneath my bed for the time being. Daniel and Clara were still asleep upstairs, and the last thing I needed was Clara discovering I had something worth guarding. I decided I would search for the key later, but first I needed to keep up the appearance of normalcy. When Clara finally emerged from the bedroom, she was dressed immaculately, as always, her silk blouse crisp, her hair cascading in dark waves. She glanced at me with a smile that never touched her eyes. "Morning, Maggie. Did you sleep well?" I forced a smile. As well as anyone can in this old house. The rain was loud. Her gaze lingered on me, sharp, probing, as though she could see straight through my practiced calm. Then she turned her attention to the pantry, rummaging noisily. I wondered if she was already searching, if the letter and the locked study had fueled her curiosity further. By midday, I returned to the study, locking the door behind me. I searched every drawer, every shelf, my fingers brushing over dust that coated the spines of Richard's books. That was when I found it, tucked between two thick encyclopedias, a small brass key, tarnished with age. My breath caught. Could it be? With trembling hands, I fetched the metal box from beneath my bed and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant click, the sound slicing through the silence. Inside lay a collection of letters, bound with a faded ribbon, and at the very top, a single photograph. The photograph made my stomach drop. It was of Clara, years younger, but unmistakably her, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. His arm was draped around her shoulders, his expression smug, almost predatory. On the back of the photo, in Richard's careful handwriting, were the words, "Not to be trusted." I froze, the photograph trembling in my hands. Richard had known her, somehow, before she ever entered our lives as Daniel's wife. He had already marked her as dangerous. But how? The letters beneath the photo called to me, but just as I reached for them, I heard footsteps approaching. I stuffed the contents back into the box and shoved it into the wardrobe just as Daniel knocked on the door. "Mom, are you in there?" I cleared my throat, forcing my voice steady. "Yes, darling. Just sorting through some old papers." The door handle jiggled. "Clara was wondering why this room is always locked. She says it makes her feel excluded." My pulse quickened. "Some things are private, Daniel, even in families." He sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "Just be careful. She really wants us to feel like this is our home, too." As his footsteps retreated, I clutched the brass key in my palm, its edges biting into my skin. My husband's warning, the photograph, the hidden letters, they weren't coincidences. They were evidence. But evidence of what? And the worst part was, Clara was already circling closer, as if she knew that the walls of this house had begun to speak against her. That night, I waited until the house had settled into uneasy silence before I dared to reopen the box. The photograph still lay on top, its edges curling with age. Richard's handwriting, a brand upon my mind. Not to be trusted. Beneath it, I untied the faded ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The words leapt out at me. Richard had written to himself, or perhaps to me, years ago. "If anything happens to me, look closer at Clara Walters. She is not who she claims to be." Walters. The name struck me like a blow. Clara had introduced herself to us as Clara Jameson when she met Daniel. She had taken his surname quickly after marriage. never once had she mentioned Walters. I shuffled through the rest of the letters. Each one contained fragments, cryptic but urgent. One mentioned financial dealings, another warned of debts that Clara had left behind in another city. One letter even included a clipped article from a regional paper, a bankruptcy notice under the name Clara Walters. My husband, meticulous as ever, had gathered these pieces like a puzzle he never finished. My stomach churned. Richard must have investigated her before his death. But why hadn't he told me? Had he meant to reveal everything, only to be silenced by his sudden heart attack, or had someone ensured his silence? A sudden floorboard creaked outside the study door. I froze, the letters still spread across my lap. The doorknob rattled once, then Clara's voice, smooth as silk. "Maggie, are you awake?" I scrambled, shoving the letters back into the box and pushing it under the desk. "Yes," I called, my voice sharper than I intended. "What is it?" There was a pause. Then, "Just making sure you're comfortable. Good night." Her footsteps retreated, but the echo of her voice lingered, threading unease through the air. The next morning, I caught Daniel alone in the garden, trimming the hedges. The smell of damp soil clung to the air as I gathered my courage. "Daniel," I said softly, "do you know anything about Clara's past?" He frowned, pushing his glasses up his nose. "What do you mean?" "Her name. Where she lived before you met. Did she ever talk about debts, or anyone she left behind?" His face flushed with irritation. "Mum, this again? Clara loves me, she's my wife. Why are you always digging?" "Because I need to protect you," I whispered, but he shook his head, dismissing my words like dust in the wind. As he walked back toward the house, the truth cut me deeper than any rejection. I was alone in this. Daniel was blinded by love, unable to see what Richard had already known. That evening, Clara made another remark over dinner, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. "You know, Maggie, houses feel safer when everyone has a key. Don't you think?" I forced a laugh, though my insides twisted. Safety comes in many forms. Sometimes locks keep danger out. Her fork clinked against her plate, her smile brittle. Or they keep people trapped in secrets. The tension between us thickened, and I realized the first twist of this ordeal had fully revealed itself. Clara wasn't just demanding access. She was determined to erase boundaries, to claim ownership of what was never hers. And now I held evidence, photographs, letters, a trail of Richard's suspicions that painted her in a darker light. But the question haunted me as I lay awake that night. How much did Clara already know about what I had found? And if she knew, how far would she go to silence me too? But what I didn't realize then was that Clara's motives ran deeper than just wanting the house keys. She wasn't merely asserting her place in the family. She was circling around a secret Richard had tried to bury long before she entered our lives. The following week, I noticed her behavior shifting. She began spending more time in town, making vague excuses about errands. She would return with glossy shopping bags, though her claims about just browsing never matched the expensive perfumes and tailored blouses she displayed in her wardrobe. I began keeping quiet records of the receipts I found crumpled in the trash, one from a jewelry store, another from a hotel cafe, both far beyond what Daniel's modest engineering salary could afford. One evening, as I sorted laundry, I discovered something chilling tucked in the pocket of Clara's coat. A folded document, stamped with the seal of a law office. My breath caught as I smoothed it open. It was a preliminary draft of a property transfer agreement with my name listed as the current owner of the house, and Clara's name typed neatly as the intended transferee. Daniel's signature line was still blank, but the implication was devastating. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just speculation anymore. Clara was preparing to take the house legally, perhaps even without my knowledge. And judging by the pristine condition of the document, this wasn't an old idea. It was recent, active. When I confronted Daniel later, choosing my words carefully, he looked bewildered. "Mom, Clara hasn't mentioned anything like that. Are you sure?" "Positive," I said, handing him the copy. His hands trembled as he read, his face pale in the fading sunlight. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Why would she—" Before I could answer, Clara appeared at the doorway, her expression unreadable. Her eyes darted to the paper in his hand, and for the first time, her mask slipped. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she smoothed it back into her usual calm. "Daniel," she said evenly, "that's just a draft. A lawyer suggested we prepare in case anything happens to your mother. It's about being responsible, not malicious." Her tone was so convincing, so measured, that I saw Daniel's resolve waver. He rubbed his temple, sighing. Maybe she's right, Mom. Maybe it's just planning." But the cold certainty inside me hardened. Clara wasn't planning for protection. She was planning for possession. That night, I returned to the hidden box of letters, desperate for more answers. Among Richard's notes, I found one that mentioned a man's name. Marcus Walters. Connection to Clara. Dangerous. My heart stopped. Walters again. Could this Marcus be the man in the photograph? The name meant nothing to me, but its repetition was no accident. And if Richard had linked Clara to someone dangerous, then her sudden push for legal ownership was more than greed. It was strategy. The walls of the house seemed to close in as I realized Clara wasn't just after the property. She was tied to something larger, something Richard had stumbled upon years before his death. And now, that same shadow was creeping into our home. The next morning, while Daniel was at work, I decided to follow Clara. It wasn't something I ever thought myself capable of, snooping, tailing another person. But desperation has a way of hardening resolve. I slipped on my old gray coat, the one that blended into any crowd, and kept a careful distance as she left the house. She walked briskly down Main Street, heels clicking against the pavement, until she stopped outside a cafe. Through the glass, I saw her slide into a booth across from a man. My breath hitched. It was the same man from the photograph in Richard's box, the one with his arm wrapped around Clara years ago. I pressed myself against the window frame, heart hammering. The man leaned forward, his hand brushing hers across the table. Clara's face softened in a way I had never seen before, tender, intimate. They spoke in low tones, and though I couldn't hear the words, the body language screamed familiarity. After half an hour, they left together, their shoulders nearly touching as they disappeared into the side street leading toward the hotel. I stayed frozen, my fingertips numb in the cold morning air. The evidence was undeniable now. Clara's motives weren't just about greed. There was betrayal woven into every glance, every secret meeting. That night, I placed the photograph and Richard's letters into a folder, tucking it beneath the floorboard in my bedroom. I needed to protect the truth until I could decide how to confront Daniel. But Clara's voice drifted through the walls as I lay in bed, her laughter mingling with Daniel's, and bile rose in my throat. The following day, Clara approached me in the kitchen. Her perfume, rose and musk, hung in the air, cloying, almost suffocating. "Maggie," she said sweetly, "I know things have been tense, but don't you think it would be better if we trusted each other? This house could be ours together. Imagine how much safer you'd feel if we shared everything." I met her gaze, my own voice calm, though every nerve inside me burned. Some things shouldn't be shared. Some things need to be protected. Her smile faltered for just a second, and in that brief crack, I saw the hunger beneath, the desperation for control. She recovered quickly, though, brushing a hand over my shoulder as she left the room. The touch lingered like ice. That evening, I heard Daniel arguing with her upstairs. His voice rose, uncharacteristically sharp. "Why did you talk to that man again? I saw the messages, Clara." Her reply was muffled, but her tone carried through the floorboards. Defensive, cajoling, manipulative. My chest ached with a strange mix of relief and dread. Daniel had finally seen a glimpse of her duplicity, but would it be enough? Or would she twist him back under her spell as she always did? I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the clock ticking like a countdown. I realized then that the second twist of this ordeal had fully revealed itself. Clara's motives weren't only financial. They were entangled with a secret relationship, perhaps even a conspiracy that stretched beyond our family. And now Daniel was caught in the crossfire, blinded by love, torn between loyalty and betrayal. The obstacle ahead was no longer just about protecting the house. It was about protecting my son from a woman whose every smile hid a sharpened blade. But what I didn't know was that the most undeniable evidence was still waiting for me. Evidence that would leave no room for excuses, no space for Clara's lies to breathe. The confrontation upstairs had left the house tense, every word and footstep echoing like a warning. Daniel avoided eye contact with me at breakfast, his spoon clinking against the bowl in a rhythm too quick, too nervous. Clara, on the other hand, was all poise. She buttered her toast with deliberate calm, humming softly as though the night's argument had never happened. That morning, while they busied themselves with their routines, I returned to Richard's study. The box of letters still sat beneath the wardrobe, but I felt compelled to search beyond it, deeper into the hidden compartments he had so carefully crafted. Behind the bottom shelf of the bookcase, I noticed faint scratches around the wood panel. With effort, I pried it loose. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a manila envelope thicker than the rest. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out. Inside was the third, most damning piece of evidence, a notarized legal document signed by Richard himself. It was an affidavit sworn before his lawyer, dated only weeks before his death. In it, Richard declared that Clara Walters, also known as Clara Jameson, had approached him under false pretenses, attempting to manipulate her way into his financial affairs. He warned that she was dangerous, connected to known fraud cases through a man named Marcus Walters, her brother. My blood ran cold. Brother. The man in the photograph, the man at the cafe, wasn't just a lover. He was family. Clara had lied about everything, even her name, weaving a false identity around Daniel while hiding her true alliances. I pressed the affidavit to my chest, my breath shallow. This was the undeniable proof I needed. Clara could manipulate Daniel, dismiss photographs, twist stories, but she could not argue against Richard's sworn testimony. That evening, I made a choice I could never take back. I decided to confront Daniel directly, to show him everything, even if it meant destroying his marriage. I waited until Clara left the house for one of her so-called appointments. The front door clicked shut, and silence followed. Daniel sat in the living room, scrolling absently through his phone. I entered with the envelope clutched in my hand. "Daniel," I said quietly, "we need to talk." He looked up, wary. "Mum, not now." "Yes, now." My tone was sharper than I intended, but the urgency pressed against my ribs. I sat across from him and slid the affidavit across the coffee table. "Read this. It's from your father." His brow furrowed as he unfolded the paper. For several minutes, the only sound was the soft rustle of pages. His face drained of color as his eyes traced Richard's words. When he finished, his voice cracked. This can't be real." "It is," I whispered. "Your father suspected her long before you ever met her, and everything we've seen, her lies, her secrets, proves he was right." Daniel leaned back, pressing his palms over his face. "God, Mum, if this is true—" "It is true, and now you must decide what to do with it." The room fell into silence, but I knew in that moment that my decision to reveal the truth had pushed us past the point of no return. Daniel sat frozen, his fingers tangled in his hair. For a long while he said nothing, only breathed shallowly as though each word from Richard's affidavit had stolen the air from his lungs. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed. "If Dad knew all this," he whispered, "why didn't he stop me from marrying her?" Tears pricked my eyes. "He tried, Daniel. He left me warnings. He left you warnings. But death came too soon." Daniel's jaw clenched. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the living room. The floorboards creaked beneath his hurried steps, the house itself groaning with the weight of his turmoil. "If this is real," he said, his voice trembling, "then Clara has lied about everything. Her past, her family, even her intentions toward me." "Yes," I said firmly, "and if she succeeds in her plan, she will take everything your father built, everything we've held on to, the house, the savings, even your trust." His pacing stopped. Slowly, he sank back onto the couch, staring at the affidavit in his hands. "What do we do?" My heart raced at his words. We. For the first time, I felt the wall Clara had built between us begin to crack. We protect ourselves, we gather evidence, and when the time comes, we act. That night, Daniel insisted on confronting Clara himself. I begged him to wait, to think, but his pride and heartbreak burned too hot. When she returned, he met her at the door, the affidavit clutched in his fist. "Clara," he said, his voice taut, "what is this?" She blinked, her expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" "This!" He thrust the document toward her. "Why does it say you lied about your name? That you're connected to fraud? That Marcus Walters is your brother?" Her face remained still, but her eyes darkened. "Where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter," he snapped. "Is it true?" Silence stretched between them, heavy as stone. Then Clara's lips curved into a smile, cold, sharp. "So you've been digging through your father's ghosts?" Daniel recoiled. "Answer me." "Yes," she said finally, her voice low. "Marcus is my brother. And yes, I've hidden things. But everything I've done, Daniel, has been for us, for our future. By stealing my mother's home, by lying to me." Clara's eyes flicked toward me, narrowing. "Your mother has poisoned you against me. Don't you see? She's terrified of losing control. That's what this is about. Power." Her words struck me like daggers, but I didn't flinch. No, Clara. This is about truth, something you've run from your whole life. Daniel's chest rose and fell rapidly, caught between us, his wife and his mother, each demanding loyalty. Finally, he dropped the affidavit onto the table, his hands trembling. "I need time," he muttered. "Time to think." Clara's smile faltered, just for a moment, before she slipped her hand into his. "Take all the time you need, love. I'll be here." But I saw it. The flicker of fury in her eyes, the silent promise of retaliation. The mask had cracked, and beneath it was something dangerous, something I could no longer allow to fester in this house. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Daniel tossed beside Clara in the upstairs room. My heart pounded with certainty. We had crossed the line. The truth was out. And whatever happened next, there was no turning back. But the confrontation in the living room was only the prelude. The real storm broke days later, when secrets could no longer hide behind calm smiles or locked doors. Daniel had grown quiet, avoiding both of us, his eyes shadowed with doubt. He went to work, came home, but rarely spoke. The silence between us stretched thin, like glass ready to shatter. And Clara became sharper. Her smiles were tighter, her voice clipped, her footsteps through the house echoing like threats. One evening, I came home from the grocery store to find the study door wide open. Panic seized me. The box, the letters, the affidavit, had she found them? I rushed inside. The wardrobe stood ajar, its contents scattered. The box was gone. "Looking for something?" Her voice cut through the air. I turned to find Clara standing in the doorway, the metal box in her hands. Her eyes glittered with triumph. "You shouldn't go through my husband's things," I said, forcing calm. "Your husband?" she sneered. "Richard was a fool. He dug into matters that didn't concern him. And now you're doing the same?" I took a step forward. "Give it back." "No," she snapped the box shut. "This is mine now, my future. You've meddled enough, Maggie." Her words struck like blows, but before I could answer, Daniel appeared behind her, his face pale. "What's going on?" Clara turned, her tone instantly sweet. "Darling, your mother is confused. She keeps clinging to old papers, accusing me of things that don't matter." I met his eyes. "Daniel, she has the evidence. The letters, the affidavit, everything." Daniel looked at Clara. "Is it true?" For the first time, Clara's mask cracked. "He doesn't need to see it. These are just lies your father left behind." "Then why hide them?" I asked sharply. "Why steal them from my room?" Her silence answered for her. The room filled with a charged stillness, broken only by Daniel's ragged breath. "Clara," he said, his voice trembling, "I need the truth. No more games." Clara's expression hardened. "Fine. The truth? Marcus is my brother. Yes, I changed my name. Yes, I left debts behind. But I did it because I wanted a new life. With you. With us. Your father hated me for it. He thought I was after his money. But you know me, Daniel. You know I love you." Her words hung heavy in the air, but Daniel's silence was louder. He stepped back, his shoulders shaking. That was when I spoke the words that had burned in my chest for weeks. "Love doesn't destroy families, Clara. Love doesn't steal. Love doesn't lie." Her eyes narrowed, fury sparking. "You old witch," she hissed. "You think you can turn him against me? You think you can hold on to this house forever?" Daniel raised his hands. "Enough! Both of you!" His voice cracked like thunder. "I can't do this anymore. Clara, if you love me, then prove it. Stop with the secrets. Stop with the lies. Hand over the box." Clara's breath came fast, her grip on the box tightening. "You don't understand, Daniel. If this gets out, Marcus will be ruined. I'll be ruined. We'll lose everything." Daniel's voice broke. "We already lost everything, Clara." For a moment, silence reigned. Then with a guttural cry, Clara hurled the box across the room. It crashed against the wall, spilling letters and documents across the floor. The truth was laid bare, scattered for all to see, and as we stood frozen, surrounded by Richard's words, Clara's final mask fell away. The letters fanned across the carpet, fluttering like wounded birds. Daniel bent down, his hands trembling as he picked one up. His eyes scanned the words, his lips moving silently, until finally he read aloud. "If anything happens to me, know that Clara Walters cannot be trusted. She seeks to use our son for her gain." The sound of Richard's voice, resurrected through ink, filled the room like a ghostly presence. Clara's face drained of color. "Daniel, don't listen," she began, but he cut her off. "No!" His voice was raw, rising with each word. "All this time you lied to me. You lied about your name, your family, your debts, and you lied about loving me." "I never lied about that," she cried, tears brimming. "I love you, Daniel. I always have. Yes, I made mistakes, but I did it because I wanted us to have a future, not to destroy you." I stepped closer, my voice low but steady. "A future built on lies always crumbles. Richard saw through you, and now Daniel does too." Clara's eyes blazed, darting between us. "You've turned him against me, both of you. Do you know what I sacrificed? Do you know what I gave up to be here?" Daniel's voice broke. "I don't care. I can't live in this web anymore." Her composure snapped. She lunged toward him, clutching his arm with a desperate grip. "Please, don't throw me away. We can fix this, Daniel." He pulled free, his tone like ice. "No, Clara, it's over." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Clara stood rigid, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Then, suddenly, her face smoothed into something eerily calm. "Fine," she said softly. "If it's war you want, then war you'll have." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the study, her heels pounding down the hall. The front door slammed, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. Daniel collapsed into the armchair, burying his face in his hands. "God, what have I done?" I knelt beside him, resting a hand on his arm. "You trust it. That's not a sin. But now, Daniel, we have truth. And truth gives us power." For the next hour, we gathered the scattered papers, organizing Richard's letters, the affidavit, the photograph. Each piece was a shard of glass, sharp and painful. But together they formed a mirror, reflecting the reality we could no longer deny. That night, Daniel drafted an email to a lawyer, attaching copies of the documents. His voice shook as he typed, but there was steel in his eyes. "If she wants war, Mum," he said quietly, "then we'll give her a battlefield she can't control. One ruled by law." Days later, Clara returned, her fury simmering beneath a mask of serenity. She walked into the living room where Daniel and I sat, holding hands in a fragile truce. "So this is it?" she said bitterly. "You're choosing her over me." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm choosing truth over lies. Dad was right about you. And now the law will decide what happens next." Her eyes flashed, but she said nothing. She simply turned and walked away, her figure framed by the doorway, like a shadow retreating into night. In that moment, the power shifted. The house, once her prize, was no longer within her grasp. The truth had broken her grip. and though the battle was far from over, the tide had turned. For the first time in years, I felt Richard's presence not as a warning, but as a reassurance. We had survived the storm. But now came the reckoning. But the reckoning, when it came, was not thunder and lightning. It was paperwork, signatures, hearings, and the cold weight of consequences delivered in plain words inside a courtroom. The weeks after Clara's departure felt strangely quiet. The air inside the house no longer carried the cloying scent of her perfume. The nights were calmer, no tense footsteps echoing above me. Yet the silence was uneasy, filled with the knowledge that she had not given up. Clara was too determined, too proud, to vanish without a fight. Daniel and I worked closely with a lawyer, Mrs. Hanley, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone. She reviewed Richard's affidavit, the letters, the photograph, and the property transfer draft Clara had tried to hide. "This is a strong case," she said firmly. "We can seek an injunction to prevent any attempt at transferring ownership of the house, and if Clara contests, these documents will hold weight." The injunction was filed swiftly, the legal stamp sealing the house's protection. For the first time in months, I slept without clutching the brass key beneath my pillow. Still, the upcoming hearing loomed like a storm cloud. When the day arrived, the courthouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Daniel sat beside me, his hands clasped tightly. Across the aisle, Clara entered in a sleek navy suit, her dark hair pinned back, her expression carved from stone. Marcus Walters was not with her, though whispers suggested he had fled town once Richard's affidavit surfaced. The judge, a stern man with silver hair, presided with measured calm. He reviewed each piece of evidence. Richard's affidavit was read aloud, his words echoing once more, stronger now that they carried the weight of legal authority. Clara's composure faltered slightly, her jaw tightening, as the judge underlined the phrase, "not to be trusted." Daniel was called to speak. His voice trembled at first but grew steadier as he described the deception, the documents hidden in the study, and the betrayal he had witnessed firsthand. Clara's lawyer tried to object, painting her as a misunderstood woman rebuilding her life. But the evidence was too heavy, too precise. The ruling came swiftly. Clara was denied any legal claim to the property. The attempted transfer was deemed fraudulent. Furthermore, the judge issued a restraining order preventing her from contacting me or Daniel directly. Should she attempt to interfere again, criminal charges would follow. The gavel struck once, final and echoing. Clara's eyes met mine across the courtroom. For the first time, I didn't see triumph or even rage. I saw something colder. Defeat. She gathered her things without a word and walked out, heels clicking one last time. The measurable outcomes were clear. The house remained mine, secured by both inheritance and law. Daniel, after weeks of torment, filed for divorce, citing fraud and concealment. By the time the papers were finalized, Clara's ties to our family were severed entirely. Financially, she left with nothing. The court recognized her deceit and denied any spousal claim. As for Marcus, rumors placed him in another state, his trail gone cold. But with the affidavit in hand, at least his name was on record, marked by suspicion. Life after justice did not return to what it was before. Grief had changed the foundation too deeply. Yet with each passing week, the house felt lighter. Richard's chair was returned to its place by the window. The kitchen walls remained white, but somehow even their sterility seemed softer. No longer a battlefield, but simply paint. Daniel moved back into his old room for a time, needing space to rebuild himself. I would hear him late at night, pacing, sometimes crying quietly. But healing is not swift. It is measured in small steps. The first smile at breakfast, the first laugh at a neighbor's joke, the first day he picked up his sketchbook again. Mrs. Grant, the neighbor who had once whispered her concern, came by with another loaf of bread. "The house feels different now," she remarked, her keen eyes scanning the rooms. "It feels like it belongs to you again." And she was right. The battle had cost us, but it had also preserved what mattered most. The legacy Richard left, the security of our home, and the bond between mother and son that Clara had nearly severed. Looking back, the justice wasn't only in the legal papers or the judge's ruling. It was in the measurable changes. The house secure, the divorce granted, Clara's absence, Daniel's slow return to himself. Justice lived not just in punishment, but in the restoration of peace. On the final night before Daniel moved into his own apartment again, we sat together in the study. The brass key lay on the desk, its edges worn but gleaming faintly under the lamp. "Do you think Dad knew it would end like this?" Daniel asked softly. I shook my head. No. But he knew enough to protect us, and he trusted us to finish what he couldn't. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He leaned over, resting his head on my shoulder. For the first time in Yang. But survival alone is not the end of a story. What remains, after all the shouting and silence, after the courtroom and the slammed doors, are the lessons that echo inside the walls long after the dust has settled. For me, the greatest lesson was that boundaries are not walls of cruelty. They are walls of love. They protect not only the home we live in, but the lives we build within it. When Richard left me that letter, when he whispered across time, "Do not give her the keys," he wasn't only protecting the bricks and mortar of our house. He was reminding me that trust must be earned, not demanded. I learned that silence can be dangerous. For years, I had swallowed my discomfort, telling myself that peace required endurance. But endurance without truth is a slow form of surrender. Had I spoken earlier, had I probed Clara's intentions before they hardened into deceit, perhaps the road would have been less painful. Or perhaps it would have been the same. Still, I know now that a quiet voice must sometimes grow loud to protect what is sacred. Daniel's lesson was harsher. He believed in love, as any man should. He believed in partnership, in building a future with someone he trusted. Yet love without truth is a castle built on sand. Watching him learn this broke my heart, but it also strengthened him. He emerged from the fire not just wounded, but wiser. Justice, I discovered, is not a grand moment of triumph. It is measured, deliberate, and often slow. It arrives through signatures and stamps, through testimony and evidence. But when it does arrive, it brings a peace that no deception can counterfeit. The injunction, the divorce, the restraining order, these were not victories of pride. They were victories of safety, and I think often of Clara too, not with hatred, though I once felt it burn inside me, but with a weary pity. What must it be like to live behind masks, to weave lies so tightly that even love is strangled? She chose deceit, and for that, she lost everything. Yet I know she will carry those choices like shadows wherever she goes. To anyone listening, I say this: guard your homes, guard your hearts, and never dismiss the small signs that something is wrong. A misplaced receipt, a demand too sharp, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. These are not just quirks. They are signals. And if your instincts whisper that something is off, listen. Trust yourself. If you find yourself in a situation where control, deceit, or manipulation creeps into your life, do not wait for it to consume you. Seek help. Speak the truth aloud. The law may seem intimidating, but it exists to protect those who stand for honesty. In many places, there are legal aid offices, community advocates, even hotlines that can guide you. You are never as alone as you think. As for me, the house remains my sanctuary. The ivy still climbs the back wall, the grandfather clock still ticks in the hallway, and Richard's chair rests once again by the window where it belongs. Sometimes, when the afternoon light filters through the curtains, I sit there and feel his presence beside me, not as a ghost, but as a reminder. Truth endures. Daniel visits often. He laughs more now, sketches again, and even talks about starting a new chapter in another city. I encourage him. He deserves love that does not hide in shadows. He deserves a partner who builds with him, not one who plots behind his back. And I remain here, a keeper of both memory and lesson. The house may be worth $500,000, but its true value lies not in money. It lies in resilience. In its walls echo stories of love, betrayal, and above all, survival. So, dear listener, I ask you, what walls protect you? What keys do you guard? And who in your life has earned the right to enter those sacred spaces? Think carefully, for once given, trust is hard to reclaim. If this story has touched you, if you have seen glimpses of your own life reflected in mine, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you listening from? What lessons have you learned about love, trust, or betrayal? Your stories matter too. And if you wish to continue walking with me through stories of family, of secrets, of truths hidden and revealed, subscribe. Together we can ensure that no deceit remains in the dark, and no voice is ever silenced again. Because in the end, the moral is simple, but unshakable. Love must be honest, boundaries must be respected, and truth, no matter how painful, is always the key that saves us